The Civil War was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader global evolution and movement of nationalism and secession during the 19th century. Joining us today is Duncan Campbell and Niels Eichhorn, authors of The Civil War in the Age of Nationalism, which will be linked in the description below. Enjoy the episode. I would like to start with a quote, which I'm sure you two are very familiar with. There are many and various lusts, of which some have names of their own, while others have not. For who could readily give a name to the lust of ruling, which has yet a powerful influence in the soul of tyrants, as civil wars bear witness? Now, when I cracked open the book and I read this quote, I was like, wow, what a way to start off this freaking book. I mean, it really kind of sets the tone, and it really got me excited. I love this stuff. It really got me excited and in the right frame of mind. So, what does this quote mean? Why did you guys choose to open the book with this quote?
Okay, as I bear responsibility for that quote, I'll answer. Uh, it, isn't this what this comes down to? I mean, it's this question of authority, lawful, unlawful authority. And the Civil War is in there because it's about the Civil War. But I mean, if you think about it, this is what nationalism comes down to. It's also, of course, what slavery comes down to. It's that a lot of things come down to. And this is why that quote, I think, summed up pretty much what we look at in this book. This question of, it's beyond tyranny. It's this question of lawful authority. And certainly this was something that was on the forefront of Lincoln's mind throughout the Civil War, was he was upholding the Constitution. He was upholding lawful authority. This is Lincoln saw it that way. He stuck to that position throughout the conflict. So this is very much, I just thought it was the quote that really summed it up. And this applies to everybody. And obviously, we're not living, the quote comes from St. Augustine, City of God. We aren't living in that world anymore. But a lot of these issues, fundamental issues of belonging and authority, tyrants, what is tyranny? Give us examples of it. This quote just summed up everything we had in the book. That's why I ended up choosing it.
Yeah, it also talking about power is very fascinating to me because I think it's a deeper discussion about human nature. When you look at human nature, do you sort of sympathize more with the Hobbesian view that humans are sort of inherently greedy and evil, or do you sort of sympathize more with Locke in that this optimistic view of human nature?
Depends what day you ask the question. Uh, um, I really, fundamentally, if you look around the world, the business of no authority and total chaos does not work out very well. My father,
Anarchism.
yeah, my father's now retired, but he worked for the United Nations and he was in Somalia for a while. This was before the U.S. Invasion, and it was a total. It wasn't so much a civil war because you didn't. Well, it was a civil war, but you didn't have like competing. You didn't have two sides like the American Civil War. You just had multiple sides and multiple groups going at it, and yeah, it was anarchy in a lot of ways. And you see, if you actually see this sort of thing, it's like, okay, authority is actually not a bad thing. On the other hand, history is replete with repressive regimes. They exist right now. My father was also in Burma and saw the democracy uprising there against the junta, and people were shot dead for demanding democracy. So this is a problem. The both men are both right and wrong at the same time. It's not an either or situation. I think it's more both.
The line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man, I believe the quote. What about you, Niels, though? What do you believe in human nature? Are you a cynic or are you an optimist?
Oh, I'm a total cynic. I want to be an optimist usually, but I'm a total cynic. And I think when you look at some of the characters that we have in the book and some of the actions that they engaged in, that you very clearly sort of see a sort of negative outlook on humanity, right? Like, I mean, like the first person that comes to my mind usually is like Bismarck, because for him it's like I don't trust anyone but myself, and I don't even trust fully myself. So I want to make sure that no one can have more power than me. I'll create a system of government that is totally designed, fitting me like a glove. But I think there's also people during this time who do believe in sort of the good in humanity, right? Sort of the abolitionist, some of the um, religious reformers who wanted to improve people and kind of lead back to the good in people. So it's a really divided century, really. So it's hard to kind of, I think the more power you have, the more easily it corrupts. And I think you do see that in many of the individuals during this period, that there is this grand struggle between how much power can I get? How much power do the people want? How much do I have to compromise in regard to that, right? That's sort of the challenge was like people like Napoleon the Third of like I want to be very powerful, but I also know that I have to take my people's desires and wishes into consideration.
Yeah, 100%. The absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's interesting, throughout this century because we see so many civil wars and rebellions, um, which sort of can become either a breeding ground for a better path forward, instilling a democracy, overthrowing a tyrannical government, or it can become a breeding ground for a totalitarian to rise to power. When you look at these conflicts, how how do I pose this question? When you're analyzing, a civil war rebellion, how what's the difference between the motives of, you know, the rebels in instilling a democracy, overthrowing a tyrannical government, or a civil war rebellion where a dictator comes to power? Can you sort of see that dichotomy in the conflicts when you're analyzing them?
Well, I think it's a very significant struggle, right? Like let's say Jefferson Davis. He comes to power based on the desire of a few individuals that come together in Montgomery and Alabama to create this new Confederate government. They pick somebody who is moderate, who is not a fire eater, and they try to kind of avoid sort of the reactionaries, this extremism, but at the same time, Davis is not a great leader for a rebellion to infuse it with inspiration. He's not a great person to kind of like gives that sense to the people to kind of say, okay, we really need to unite and stand strong, and like the inspiration, right? So I think sometimes that is really a big issue with with these movements, that you have a small group that starts they are able to get the people to follow, but they're not always the best of leaders in um, achieving the goals.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, one thing I hope comes across in this book is fundamentally this idea of the nation and nationalism. It's powerful. It's extraordinarily powerful. And I mean, I just the other day I was rereading Ken the Stamp's essay on perpetual union, and he goes into this great investigation as to was secession actually condoned by the Constitution. Stamp takes this question seriously. He says you have to take it seriously because the Southerners took it seriously, and so did a fair number of people in the North. That legally, what they were doing, they could do, even if it didn't matter what their motive was. They had a legitimate right to do what they were doing. Now, Stamp comes to the conclusion that actually you can't decide either way, which is fair enough. But it takes me back to Lincoln. I mean, it's unusual to like a lot of historians really can't get their head around the fact that Lincoln was a nationalist. fundamentally his motivations are those of a nationalist. This is a united people, the Americans. They came into existence with the Declaration of Independence. No one group of Americans does not have the right to separate from the other groups of Americans. No. And if you dispute that, he will kill you in the final analysis. And it's kind of this no, but this is true of a lot of these other leaders. With this unification is often actually brutal. This is an absolute uncompromising position they take, and this is something which we do need to be aware of, that they're all very different, but they've got this motivation driving them.
Well, I think you're raising another good point with regard to legitimacy, right? Like, it doesn't matter who you ask. Like, the Irish will find a reason why their cause for independence is legitimate. The Hungarians will find a cause why theirs is legitimate, and like it will make people's head explode because some of these are extremely complicated. And in the same way, Sicilian people will say we should be an independent country, move away from Naples, and not be part of the new Italian nation state. It is. It goes to the fundamental struggle of this period of who are you and where do you belong.
But here's an example for you, right? John Stuart Mill, the great liberal leader, he wrote this article in Fraser's magazine. There's a Victorian journal. A lot of Civil War historians are familiar with it. And basically, John Stuart Mill says the South is in the wrong because they're seceding to defend slavery. And he said the mere fact they are doing that makes them the enemy of mankind. That gets quoted a lot, and it's all fine and good. But if you actually read Mill's essay from beginning to end, he also expressly says the Irish have no right to break away either. He compares Southern secession to Irish rebellion. He expressly states this in the article. And again, this is sort of like British nationalism coming to the fore here. A sense that, the United Kingdom is inviolate. Nobody can rebel against it. And I can certainly understand why modern readers and right now would dispute and say there's a big difference in Irish independence and Confederate independence. But it is interesting that John Stuart Mill, your great 19th century British liberal, who's fully on the side of the North, does not make that distinction.
Yeah, I want to flesh out the thesis of this book now. You know, my understanding, the thesis of this book is how the Civil War isn't necessarily an isolated conflict. It's part of a larger global evolution and transformation and movement of nationalism. This is really where we see the rise of nationalism globally. But I do want to sort of define terms before we can continue this discussion. I want to really define what nationalism is. That way we can sort of fall back on that throughout the rest of this conversation.
The trouble is, as I point out, there's definitions, plural, of nationalism. You've got people like George Orwell are saying, well, the difference between the patriot and the nationalist is a patriot loves his country, the nationalists hate other countries. Um, this is a problem. I can reel off quotes all day about this. But generally in the 19th century, it took on this idea, very often ethnic, that there was a group of people with a shared culture, mystic chords of memory, as a certain someone put it, and that they deserve to have a state of their own. That is, that they have this right to a territory, government of their own. And by definition is exclusionary, because some people do not belong to this nation, even if they're actually in it. But it's also very much unifying, because everybody who fits the criteria belongs, even if, for instance, they don't believe they do, as some of the people in this book, dispute whether or not they are what they are supposed to be or what they are claimed to be. So it's tricky, but in a lot of ways, it's also buttressed by the rise of the energization of religion in this period. There's often religious aspects to it. For example, in the United States, you've got this resurgent Protestantism Hence, this seeing, for instance, Catholics as an alien force within the US, see the know nothings and all the rest of it. But other nations similarly have this battle over religion and ethnicity. So it doesn't really come down to any one thing. It's a hodgepodge of ideas and concepts that hold people together. There's secular nationalists, there's religious nationalists, there's ethnic nationalists, there's civic nationalists. This is the problem. It's actually quite a protean brute that's quite hard to nail down. Go on, Niels.
Yeah, and I was going to add. I expected Duncan to actually go into the depths of the Westphalian peace and pre-modern nationalism that we debated at length when we wrote the first chapter of the book. But in many ways, what all of this comes down to, whether we're looking at this being an ethnic situation, we still have to kind of define what ethnically, say, makes you like Magyar in Hungary, or what makes you Irish compared to an English person in the Irish lands. So whether this is then religious, whether this is historic, whether this is a cultural or traditional difference, it really becomes a kind of an elite based imagining of a community that is taking place. And that's why Benedict Anderson was very important, sort of from argumentative perspective as we conceived of this, because it is not just that when we talk about nationalism that it is a static thing. It is a constantly reinventing thing, reaffirming thing, that when you look at the South, right, you start with um, Jefferson and Madison sort of as your brainchilds, you get to Calhoun, you get to the 1850s, but that then continues on with the Lost Cause and Confederate memory and monument building. And that is in every civilization the same thing, that we see that they're kind of developing a nationalist idea, and then that gets reformulated over time and new ones start to emerge, right? That by the 1870s, as say the German nation state or the French nation state are becoming more clearly defined as what they are, what it means to be French or what it means to be German, new identities then take on, and you start to see people saying like, no, I'm not just French, I'm also communist, or I'm also socialist, or what have you. So it's this, it kind of goes to what Duncan said, this kind of muddled mess of identities that people have, but a lot of these are imagined. That which imaginary bubble do you belong to?
But this is something that, we hope comes out of the book, is that all of us just take nation states for granted. That as human beings, it's quite natural we should be in nation states and they're somehow eternal or immortal. And that's not really the case. As they're entities that have undergone incredible change over time. And this is another thing, they're actually a lot less solid than you often think. And the nations, they're all cut up in transnational movements and issues. Like, you can't, unless you're planning on being North Korea, and even North Korea can't do this, you can't shut out all the trends that are going on outside of your little nation state or your little contained area. And you are being caught up in this as well, whether you like it or not. This is kind of one of the dilemmas that nationalists have, one form or another.
It is sort of an evolution over history, this idea of the nation state and nationalism, because we go from this period of imperialism and big empires, and small parts of those empires start to develop identities of their own, cultures of their own. What what do you see as the boiling point in terms of a small group within a larger nation or empire that starts to develop their own identity? When does it hit a boiling point where it justifies secession, rebellion, civil war, to sort of declare their independence as their own nation state?
That's a good one.
Differs, I would say it differs from case to case. I mean, there's people in this world who are oppressed who have not, in fact, risen up and formed a successful nation state. And there's other people who, you know, were subject in retrospect to pretty mild, repression. In some cases, can you call it that? And they nonetheless rebelled. It's not, there's no one, there is simply no hard and fast rule for this. It's certain things you obviously need is you need a literate culture because somebody has to create these myths and they have to be widely disseminated. That's an absolute crucial ingredient. Um, it goes beyond something like Tom Paine's common sense. It just goes to all the myths and stuff that get collected and created. And what is interesting is nation states are almost they're created before they come into existence. Basically, people create this idea of a national identity that almost comes into existence before any proper national identity. There's not a lot of examples in the world where people are suddenly independent and then have to craft a national identity. In fact, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but somebody will find one, I'm sure. But it is kind of interesting, this idea that you have to actually, first of all, imagine your community, to use Benedict Anderson's phrase, and then go about bringing into existence. It is actually this seems to be common to everybody involved.
Well, I think you used a very perfect and fitting word choice there, like the myth, right? That like no one that Lincoln was working with was intending to take all the slaves away and emancipate everyone in the South. But in the mind frame of Southerners, that was exactly what was going to happen. In the same way that like people in Ireland think that the British are engaging in a purposeful genocide to eradicate and thin out the Irish population during the famine, right? Or that the Danish king is trying to incorporate the Duchies of Schleswig-Holstein permanently into Denmark and turn every German into Danes. So it's like it's very much what I in the previous book, like Liberty and Slavery, described as perception. It's all about perception. Like people perceive they're oppressed, people perceive they're wronged, and that gives the impetus to then be like, now I'm going to react. And it's
Catholics are loyal to the Pope, not to the Republic or the kingdom. It's this stuff pops up all the time, and it's interesting how this always does.
Yeah, speaking of myth, I think this is an important aspect in all of this, and that is propaganda. I'm reading Dear Reader right now, which is sort of a unauthorized autobiography of Kim Jong Il of North Korea, and you see how propaganda plays such a big role in nationalism. Can you speak to sort of, in the broader sense of nationalism and all of these conflicts, what role did propaganda play in propagating myths sort of to push agendas and formulate these various identities?
I would say it's fundamental, right? Like, I mean, you like just I'm going to use the Irish example because I think it's a great one, right? Like, you have national newspapers that they would not think of it as engaging in propaganda. They're like you have John Mitchell in there and says, "You need to learn how to build barricades. You need to prepare for revolution." Speeches that then say, we can't surrender the sword because if we do, we're going to give up everything that is our ability to defend ourselves against oppression. So I don't think the individuals we're looking at would have seen what they're doing as propaganda, but from our modern perspective, it is propaganda that they're propagating a imagining of a community and a defense of that community against an outside or internal other that then can lead to violence.
You also need, I mean, the most successful nation states, I use this term advisedly, are those that basically identify something that most people regard as inherently good, and so that people sign on to that, like liberty. Like, there's not really a lot of people who are don't like the idea of liberty. Okay, um, but it's interesting. Both the British and the Americans claim to be lands of liberty, and to an extent, they are compared to some others. On the other hand, if you're Irish, British liberty is not that great. If you're Native American or African American, U.S. liberty isn't that great. Frederick Douglass's "What is the Fourth of July to a Slave?" This is the point. If you start this, these myths and that they create, and Bismarck, when he wants to unify Germans, makes very certain that France declares war on the German Bund. I mean, he makes absolutely sure that he can present this as a defensive war. They're attacking us. This is absolutely critical. So some of this stuff is thoughtful propaganda, but sometimes it's just latching on to ideas that are inherently good and insisting that your state, your people adhere to these or this concept much more than others. And Niels is right. A lot of these people wouldn't see it as propaganda. Um, I believe what Lincoln said at Gettysburg was a sincere expression of his thoughts, insofar as you can tell. I've no doubt what Lincoln said at Gettysburg was what he believed. That is, I think, an honest enunciation of his aims. But it is very much a nationalist speech, and it hits a certain number of concepts Americans have about themselves. In that sense, it works. It is a political speech aimed to win over an audience. It has intent and purpose. And this is also part of nationalist crafting. It's what you do. And everybody does it to some extent. As we make the point, Louis Kossuth probably planted the idea in his head about how to end the Gettysburg Address, because Kossuth was speaking to the Ohio legislature on Hungarian nationalism and what the Hungarians were fighting for, the Magyars were fighting for. It is interesting how this goes across the board.
Yeah, propaganda can also play a role in propagating, like Neil said, this sense of othering people. It's us versus them, which further entrenches that nationalist identity. Which brings me to think, which I think is a very important question to debate: is nationalism a force of unity or division?
Well, I guess that would depend, right? My students always hate when I say that, but it depends. But it depends on who you are, right? If you are the othered, it's not a force of union in the state. If you are the force that is othering, it can bring union. Um, in the great scheme of things, I totally get why nationalists other, right? We always do that. It doesn't matter whether it is like some of your listeners are maybe football fans, right? If you're University of Alabama, you need Auburn because that's the other that you need to defeat every November. In the same way that for a long time the British needed France because France was the evil other that needed to be defeated for religious reasons, political reasons. They eat snails and frog legs or whatever it is.
Yeah, the trouble is though, it's a double-edged sword, because reality is so far we haven't managed to create any other form of, I'm going to use this term advisedly, democracy, but let's go with representative government instead. We haven't really been able to do it without the nation state. Empires are notoriously not about representative government. So this is the other side of this nation building and nationalism, is it does seem to give people some kind of control over their government. So you can see the negatives, but there's the positives as well. So it's not simply a question of, oh, it's necessarily inherently wrong. It brings about benefits. It just depends who you are. Niels is right. If you're the other, there's not much in the way of benefits to be had. But very often, if you're part of the larger whole who are in this, there are definite benefits.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Glad you brought up democracy. Do you think that, we see through the Enlightenment the rise of democracy and representative government and liberalism? Do you see that as a precursor to the nationalism movement of the 19th century?
Well, I would think if you ask Giuseppe Mazzini, who is like one of the 19th century brains behind a liberal form of nationalism, and he would say that the two have to emerge and develop concurrently with one another. That the Italian nation can only function well if it is a republic in which all the people have a say. Um, of course, then you look at other places, and that's other thinkers who would disagree with that, and we would see monarchical based nation states, right? Like the German nation state on some level will be, the Italian nation state eventually will be. But I think deep down, some of the foremost thinkers of nationalism in the 19th century would have very much wanted a probably not democratic nation because they didn't necessarily all trust the masses with the requirements of what an intellectually informed citizenship entails. But they definitely would have wanted a nation state that is republican in some form, that has some form of representative body um, governing it.
It's a bit of a chicken and egg question because most of these emerging nationalists in the 19th century understood the need for popular support. And so, I mean, and yeah, some of them exploited it, but a lot of them were quite sincere in that they did want to get a sort of general body politic agreeing on things. So it's a bit tricky that way. I mean, again, I've said this in the book. I stress this: the trouble with democracy in the 19th century is over half the population, women, don't have any say. This is why I just prefer representative government. And it's just one of these phrases you just need to be careful bandying about. I mean, women are basically regarded by most Western societies as their husband represents her or their father represents their interests, which obviously I'm not thinking a lot of your listeners. Well, I hope not a lot of your listeners are going to agree with that. But this is the issue. I mean, this idea of representative governments changed so much from that point that we're talking about an almost completely different animal in some respects. But I do think this urge to get the people behind you was important. And that, in a sense, kind of brings about almost forces people to be more liberal or more Republican than they perhaps would have been normally. I would suggest that.
For sure. Niels, you mentioned earlier a little bit about the pre-modernist views. That's one thing that you guys talked about in chapter 1 of the book was this modernist versus pre-modernist view of nationalism. Can you sort of explain that and compare and contrast them?
All right. Yeah. I understand this is a simplified version of the debate about nationalism because I'm trying to confine an extremely complex topic into a single chapter. Basically, scholars of nationalism are divided over when nationalism comes into existence. And I kind of divided into early modernists, and this is an original idea of mine, or the modernists. Early modernists trace it back usually to Westphalia, 17th century. The modernists tend to say no, it's either the French Revolution or the American War of Independence, depends which scholar you read. And it's more or less, as you said, it requires the Enlightenment to bring about the concept of the nation, whereas the pre-modernists say, no, 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 the Enlightenment grew out of the existence of the nation state. So it's one of these debates. I did my best. It's interesting because Niels is more of a modernist and I'm more of a pre-modernist. So we did our best to make sure we were fair to both camps in this. I'm sure, people will have their disagreements on that. But I just think in some ways, some states in Europe, I think France, for instance, to me anyway, France strikes me as already got a national identity before the Enlightenment. I don't think the French Revolution creates a French identity. I think the French Revolution augments and develops a French identity. I also think the English have a sense, rather than the British, the English have a sense of who they are as a people before the modern period. So I think the thing is, as I say, it's less important to say when exactly this absolute concept of the nation comes into existence. I think it's just more important to see how it develops. And I do stress again, the 19th century idea of the nation state is quite different to our modern one. We're all civic nationalists now, or most of us are. It's pretty much won the battle. That's simply not the case in the 19th century. We also, the modern welfare state is simply the 19th century. Well, yeah, it comes in with Bismarck a bit at the end, but let's say in the early 19th century, the welfare state would not be comprehensible to them. So it's this again with nationalism and the nation. It's a concept that keeps changing and developing.
Yeah, for sure. It's an evolution, not necessarily a black and white birth of nationalism, I guess. Let's get into the American Civil War now, and the role of nationalism in that. So prior to the secession, there was this brewing of different visions of nationalism for the North and the South. They each sort of had their own identities, contributing to that schism. So, what's the role of nationalism in the American Civil War?
Well, the U.S., as we said, is an unfinished country. American nationalism is, in a large part, I know the Southern Unionists, but the reality is it's largely confined to the North. When Lincoln calls for volunteers, thousands upon thousands of people enlist. But this is also true in the South. When Southern states put out a call, and in the end, they both have to rely on conscription. But at the outset, there's this enthusiasm. These white Southerners say they're fighting for their this new nation, or at least fighting for their state, which they see as the nation. Northerners feel very differently. And this is a sense where you just don't have a unifying American nationalism at this point because the two sides are prepared to fight for these two separate nations, I dare say it, the Confederate States and the United States.
Well, I think the other part to consider with this is sort of the competing national identities, right? Like if you ask somebody in Massachusetts, they would probably say first that they are part of the United States. But if you ask certain individuals in, say, South Carolina, they probably would say that their identity is first and foremost South Carolinian, and then being part of the United States. Or at the very least, South Carolina would be very high and in the same moment uttered as the United States. And that's sort of the challenge during this period, that we're not in the like turn of the century, like 1790s to 1800s, 18 teens anymore, where we kind of have three identities in the United States, right? The Northeast, old New England colonies, the South, and the West anymore, because the West has sort of been probably getting burned for this, but it's sort of been colonized by New England, the New Yorker community, and the South has sort of spread westward within the South. So we have like a North-South identity now, but the Southern identity has done a lot more over the last decades leading up to the Civil War than in other parts of the country, kind of formulating identity documents, doctrines that see it as separate, right? Like just saying it's a nullification crisis, and you get the Compromise of 1850, we get the National Convention, we get Kansas, Nebraska, and all of this. Again and again, you see Southern writers who are going and saying, like, we need to think of ourselves as separate. We need to think of our rights that need defending, and they're much better. I hate to say it that way, but they're much better at kind of formulating that separate identity than the rest of the country is to kind of formulate what it means to be a United States, right? That's what Lincoln has to do in many ways, and the war has to do, kind of fuse the country together and kind of create a language that unites people in the country, even if there's still others, whether that's the Irish or the Germans or Catholics or Japanese or Chinese eventually in the West, but or Native Americans, of course, or African people. Um, but there is more of a union now.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's such an interesting point to make when looking at this conflict. in specific is all of the states and regions still had their own identities. Sort of see the Civil War as the unfinished business of the American Revolution. Because coming out of the American Revolution, we have the Declaration of Independence declaring ourselves an independent nation. We have a constitution that formulates a form of government that is national. The United States of government. We are the United States of the government, as opposed to separate states having their own individual identities. So I do think that's very important. Why coming out of the American Revolution, after this independence movement, we have a national constitution? Why didn't this national identity develop then?
Well, I mean, my best answer to that is the 13 colonies were quite distinct. I mean, if you look at Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, why he goes to London in it, okay? And he doesn't bother describing London to his readers at all. But whenever he visits somewhere in America, quite a bit of, particularly Philadelphia, quite a bit of time is spent discussing it. Because for colonial and even very early national Republic Americans, they all know what London is. That's a metropole, or it's a former metropole now. They don't really know. New Yorkers aren't terribly interested in Charleston. Much of the direction is coming from London. It's not coming from Charleston. And of course, the states themselves, and when this is just US History 101, obviously, are very different. I mean, Virginia's origins are completely different to that of New England's. And so you don't really have any, I mean, American unity, yeah, it's there in the war, although don't forget a large chunk of Americans, I mean, what was it? John Adams figured 1/3 support the revolution, 1/3 support the crown, and 1/3 just wait to see which way the wind would blow. Now, I know historians have disputed what he said, but it's kind of interesting that, one of the founding fathers comes and basically says, well, really on 1/3 of the population wanted the break. So Americans are themselves, they're already divided. Then the War of 1812, New England effectively almost secedes from the United States. It doesn't actually formally secede, but it basically tries to sit out the war because it's not in New England's interests as far as New England Federalists are concerned. So this kind of unity, it's actually less, to me, it's kind of interesting. The assumption is Americans will all come together. But you see, that's not what happened in Latin America. And I think in some ways it's more interesting, why did the Americans come together in the first place, whereas the Latin Americans didn't? And don't forget, just north of the United States, there's a country called Canada, where all the Americans who didn't support the revolution went, with all due respect to the French Canadians. So this kind of in some ways, the question should be, why did Americans unite, rather than that it should be assumed they would unite, even with the revolution? Because the Latin American nations didn't. They all dissipated into their own body politics.
I'm going to take that a little differently and do a real world kind of a worldly example. Like the place I'm living at right now, there's actually 4 houses and 13 units of apartments. Okay, kind of like the 13 colonies. Actually works perfectly. I just made that out of my mind. And I know, and I'm good connected to about half of the residents or half of the people. I have at least 4 neighbors that I've never talked to, that I don't know their names. I don't know what they do. I don't we work for the same place, but I don't know what they do, what's in this. So it's sort of like what you have in the 13 colonies, right? You ask somebody in like upstate New York, what's Charleston, South Carolina, or what's Savannah, Georgia like? They would be like, I don't know. Right? So the interests are different, right? There's like 3 in this apartment complex who are pretty much exclusive English speakers, and then you have the others who are not, who are like, some of them probably are not very good at English actually. So I think that's a good example to consider, is that we as people sometimes don't know each other. Even though we live right on top of each other, we don't necessarily talk with each other. We don't engage with each other. And the revolution forced some of that engagement. But then you look at a place like Rhode Island that is just all right, we're independent now. I'm going to boycott everything, right? I don't show up for anything. I don't want to deal with the Constitution's ratification. Oh shoot! Now everyone voted but me, but it takes effect for me too because that's how they designed this thing. So it's sort of like, yeah, like it. I, I agree with Duncan that when you look at it, it's not a very unified place. It might, from our perspective today, in sort of a patriotic way, seem very unified, but it's a very disjointed region. Like even within the states, from upstate South Carolina to the Piedmonts, to the coastal plains, right? There's more in common between Charleston and Savannah than between Charleston and Columbia because of the difference in regionality.
Yeah, this is, I think, the problem with hindsight being 2020. I mean, I'm one of these who agrees with the historians who say it wasn't the Union victory was not fait accompli. The South might have actually won its independence. And had that happened, we'd be living in a very different world and it'd be like the Confederate States of America and the United States of America. Well, okay. I'm sure there'd be historians saying, well, that was inevitable. They were always destined to be apart because they were so different. So this is the other aspect to it. This is the fact about the American Civil Wars. Actually, yes, you do get a unified, more or less, nation state out of it, which probably did not really exist beforehand.
Yeah, it's sort of this idea that you guys write about in the book that the price of secession or independence is partition. And once these nations, these masses of land, these people gain their independence, they fracture themselves into smaller and smaller bits of land or identities. Like you said, this happened all over Latin America when they got their independence from Spain. They sort of partitioned into all these little separate countries, and that did happen to the U.S. You know, we got our independence from Great Britain, but then we ourselves partitioned into two separate, national identities. So you think the reason for that is sort of cultural differences and different interests?
It varies on a case by case basis. I don't, and Niels doesn't either. Neither of us challenge the general consensus that slavery underpinned the major difference between the North and the South. So that's that. I mean, do I see the American Civil War happening without slavery? Not really, because I'm not sure what else causes they really had that would have actually forced a difference between them. The last time there was any sort of serious schism was the War of 1812. That was, well, I see as part and parcel of the wider Napoleonic Wars, and national identity being challenged then too. So in some ways, the U.S. is being quite normal having a schism over that. But once you're in peace, you're living in peace, your borders are relatively secure, there isn't really a lot of threats. How would this happen? Slavery really looks like the cause. There isn't really, I don't think there's any debate about that. But obviously, other places are different. Um, Language is one thing that causes splits. I mean, we looked at Canada as an example of nation building, and the big divide there is between the English speakers and the French speakers. So language that, and but the schism, Bismarck, Bismarck's unification of Germany means keeping Austria out. Austria is a large German-speaking empire. And so this new Germany, the German people schism in that sense, in that the German speakers are not living in one unified whole. You have Germans and you have Austrians. It's kind of interesting the way these schisms work, and it's usually local politics, but language is one, religion's another. I mean, it goes on.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. It really depends, right? Like I was thinking of like my go-to example, Hungary, but you could even think of Italy, right? Like southern Italy and northern Italy being so different from one another, and eventually you have that civil war in the south because there's all these locals there that think that they are owed something, that they should be more part of it, but there's language barriers within Italy, right? That they don't understand each other well. So it it can be linguistic, it can be religious, it can be ethnic. It simply it like I hate to bring it down back to where we started. It's like the imagining, right? Like I imagine myself as different, and I have a community that thinks of itself as different. And with that, I have enough reason to say I want to break away. Whereas that is imperial, or even within a nation state. Right? I mean, that's sometimes a challenge that even though today we consider ourselves for the most part to live in nation states, there's still wrangling, right? Like you ask the Scots, they will tell you they are not part of of Britain. Or you'll ask the Catalonian people, and they will be like, "Nope, I do not want to be part of Spain." Right? And I don't speak Spanish; I speak Catalan.
And then, of course, in Canada, Quebec has a national assembly, even though it's just a province. So, yeah, it's depends where you go. I mean, it's there, it's real. At the same time, though, I don't want to make light of some of these differences. There are cultural differences among people, and some of these cultural differences are profound.
Some Germans like to wear lederhosen, which is terrible.
Uh, is that actually true? I always thought that was a stereotype. But this is what I know. But no, it just this is it. It's there are it's there's legal different cultures that the Code Napoleon is famously very different from English common law. These are two very, very different legal systems, and trying to put them together in a common system would be very difficult indeed. And it's yeah, this is a thing. And how do you accommodate all these differences? Well, it's yes, it's imagined, but some of them are real, and some of them are very difficult to overcome. It's this is the issue. It's not by any means simple at all.
Yeah, it's very complicated and nuanced. You do have to look at it on a case by case basis, sort of evaluate each one separately. But I do want to talk about the secession of the South. It seems that you two are in agreement as to the reason for it, that being slavery. And we touched on it a little bit earlier about the constitutionality of secession. And um, this is a question I find very interesting. I had a whole podcast episode a couple months back all about Southern secession, and we talked a lot about the constitutionality of it. It seems that the North and South had different interpretations of the Constitution. So why did the South secede, and was it constitutional?
Honestly, I'm afraid I'm going with Kenneth's stamp on this. I think you can make as many arguments for as against. It's not as if it's like all such like legal decisions. It's not legal political decisions. It's not. It's in the end, it will come down to opinion because what you're doing. I mean, Kenneth Stamp. I'll go back to this essay just because I read it recently. It's fresh in my mind. He made the point that one of the arguments is, well, perpetual unions may mention the Articles of Confederation. Stamp just goes, well, hold on, you can't cite the Articles of Confederation because the founders violated them because in order to replace the Articles of Confederation, you had to get unanimity. They just went with 9 out of 13. So according to Stamp, the Articles you cannot cite the Articles of Confederation for for perpetual union. That's just his opinion. I could counter by saying, well, not necessarily. Just because they say rejected one aspect of the articles unworkable doesn't mean they rejected the entire articles. Lincoln at Gettysburg says, no, no, no. The United States of America as a nation dates from the Declaration of Independence. That's the nation's, he didn't say this exactly, but that's the nation's birth certificate. The nation is born in 1776, not 13 independent states. You tell me. This is your. We could have a comment section here, and people would pile in, and everybody would have different opinions on this. It's very you can passionately and logically argue for either way. So this is where I'm sort of like, well, I'm sitting on the fence on this, but understand it was a real issue. People believe they had the right to secede, and other people believe they did not. There's not really much doubt about the sincerity on both sides in this war. I don't think I don't think the secessionist cause was made up by John C. Calhoun, for example. I just think he was one of the more able propagandists of it, but the argument was there.
No, I was actually going to make the exact case that Duncan just tried to raise there with regard to the John C. Calhoun, because I think I agree with Duncan that it depends on who you ask, right? But I think that when it comes down to the Southerners, with going back to Jefferson, Madison, but then really with Calhoun, lay out, as flawed as it may be from whichever perspective you come to it, a strong constitutional argument that kind of says that if you look at the Declaration of Independence, we have the right to stand up against oppressive government. The United States was the Constitution of the United States was ratified by the states, not the people, because it was state conventions that did this, and they string together selectively, like every court these days does, a legal argument that when your rights are trampled upon, or you perceive your rights are being trampled upon, you have a right to resist and declare these null and void. If that is then challenged, you can take it another step and secede. So that I would like, I can see a good constitutional argument and a current argument that's based on the history of the United States with regard to the null and void part. Whether to take that then all the way to secession, well, I guess the Declaration of Independence would give you that right.
Right. I think that's the best case, or the best explanation and justification for the South seceding, is that the United States was founded by seceding from the British Empire. They gained their independence from the British Empire. And then, even Lincoln, he says the nation dates back to the Declaration of Independence. Sort of his vision of America is rooted in the Declaration of Independence, this idea that if we disagree with an oppressive, tyrannical regime, we can declare our independence and secede from that. And that's exactly what the South did, honestly. They thought that they were being oppressed by the North, so they declared their independence and seceded from that.
Yeah, it's also interesting as well that, William Lloyd Garrison argued that the northern states should secede from the South to get away from slavery. So it's not as if the Southerners were the only ones who raised or broached secession. Other people did as well. And I'm sure William Lloyd Garrison didn't believe he was advocating anything illegal. Um, this is a well, yeah, maybe. But on the other hand, against Calhoun, you have Webster saying the Constitution is not a compact. It's a rich literature on this, and it's, as I say, in the end, it will come down to opinion, I think.
I, I think in part when we think of Lincoln, we always think of him as sort of that, like that guy on the monument, right? I'm going to go with the Lincoln Monument in Washington, right? It's a white marble. He's this towering figure. He's usually portrayed as that brilliant legal mind and everything. But when you look at some of the aspects during the Civil War, and there's some doubt, right? Like when you Duncan and I have done a lot of diplomacy, and Lincoln declares a blockade of the southern ports, and Britain is like, you said it's an internal rebellion, but you're blockading your own ports? That doesn't make sense. Legally, it just doesn't make sense. You can't do that. You have to put an embargo on these ports, legally speaking. So Lincoln makes, and I don't want to get into, because we didn't talk about it in the book, but if you read William Marble's book on Fitzjohn Potter's trial after Second Manassas, Lincoln is not very brilliant at all, legally speaking, in that situation. You could make a case with Van Landingham that it's not very brilliant what he is doing.
In Lincoln's defense, he did say he didn't get the opportunity to practice international law in Illinois, which I thought was a good response. Sorry, go on.
Right, but I think this sort of comes down to, right, this um, Lincoln, and there were lots that believed that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were an anti-slavery document too, and that you of course have Southerners, and the way you can read it is it's not an anti-slavery document. So it's I guess that's the beauty and the curse of the U.S. Constitution. You can read it in so many different ways, and the founding of the United States in so many different ways, right? That whole originalist stuff. Like, I don't have Madison handy for me to pull off from the Constitutional Convention, no minutes, but it's like it's just some notes. We can't even remotely assess what the founders were saying, right? And it's very hard in that regard to kind of.
Yeah, that's true. To sort of linger on what I'm going to call Lincoln's hypocrisy, um, the North and Lincoln viewed the South and their secession as violating the Union, violating the Constitution. But Lincoln himself violated the Constitution, by getting rid of or suspending habeas corpus, overreaching and exercising vast executive power that was, clearly defined in the Constitution. So can you speak to that aspect of Lincoln and the Civil War?
Well, I think in many ways this boils down to what we describe in the chapter on realpolitik, because Lincoln, like most politicians during this period, be that like Juarez in Mexico, be that um, Napoleon, Bismarck, Cavour, Gorshakov in Russia, they are first and foremost thinking about the aggrandizement and security and best interest of their state. And when you're faced with a major crisis that threatens the very existence of your nation, of your state, you're willing to forego temporarily some of the constitutional limitations that are placed upon you, right? Like Bismarck basically says, all right, you don't want to cooperate with me, Landtag, then I will ignore you and just use the monies that I can collect anyways to increase the military power. And you will cheer me when I bring about German unification. Right? And you can see that very much in the, I'm going to forget the second case, but in the Supreme Court. They will agree with what Lincoln did in Van Landingham because they understood that in this moment of political crisis, Lincoln will ignore them if they disagree with him. But once the crisis of war is over and certain level of saneness has returned, they very much will be like, no, you were wrong in this type of situation. And I think yes, we can definitely think of this as Lincoln being hypocritical and ignoring the constitutional limitations. But I think in the larger scheme, what we also want to consider is that the United States eventually did return to that constitutionality, right? That we didn't drift like, let's say, Mexico, right? Juarez then has to use emergency powers. Eventually, they will return to the Constitution, but then within 10 years, it gets a Porfirio Rato with Porfirio Diaz. So, long term, the state collapsed into a dictatorship. That didn't happen in the United States. So, it is, as much as I hate making an exceptionalist argument, there is sort of something where the United States didn't have that drift.
Well, there is one thing that does mark the U.S. out as well, I would note, is, and this ties back to our earlier point about secession, they don't actually try Jefferson Davis and the others. There are no treason trials. I know they hang some guys for war crimes, but that's different. That's murder and whatever. They don't actually try to put a legal case against these guys. They imprison them, they do all the rest of it, but they never actually go to court on this. And I've always found that very interesting. And I think part of it's common sense. They don't want to create martyrs. So that's okay. But it's interesting for all the legal talk and all the rest of it about the Constitution. They don't actually take this to court. Jefferson Davis is just released, as are the other Confederate commanders. and that's it. Uh, kind of that's the end of the story. The late unpleasantness is over, and that is it. That too, I've always found very interesting.
Yeah, I would have to agree with both of you. In times of war, especially when the Union is in jeopardy, um, sometimes you have to take sort of extraordinary measures. And also, at the time of secession, Congress, I don't think, was in session. So Lincoln didn't really have anywhere to go. He was like, if I need to do something about this and I need to do it now, I'm going to have to take these measures. But I think, Duncan, you make a great point. Following the Civil War, of not trying Jefferson, not having any trials of treason, not only because they don't want to make him martyrs, but also I think because they don't want to set a precedent. It's sort of like when George Washington stepped down after his second term. You don't want to set a precedent of ruling for life. You want to set the precedent of peace and forgiveness forward following the Civil War. But another aspect you guys talk in the book, to sort of go back to the thesis of the book, that the Civil War is part of a larger global series of events. You say that Southern secession did not occur in a vacuum, and previous secessionist movements informed the American rebels' decision. Can you speak to that?
Well, that is beautiful. Thank you. No, it's a very interesting situation in that you have so many moments, right? This goes back to very much the nationalism. We have so many places where we have a colliding of identities. The United States just being one amongst many. And the Southerners very much looked, and other movements as well, they all looked to each other of like, how did you justify yourself? How did others justify them? Like, I read for my previous books the Hungarian Declaration of Independence in 1849. And it's the same structure as the American Independence Declaration of Independence. They knew what was going on. They knew this was a tool, a structure that gave them a sense and ability to legitimize their cause, right? If it worked in one place, it will work in ours, or it will justify what we are doing. And we need, that's always the key part. That's why we have the secession declarations in the US. That's why the Hungarians do it, why others do it eventually too. We need to outline why we're doing it, because that way the international community that will recognize us hopefully and assist us hopefully, which most times doesn't happen, knows why we're doing it, why we are in the right versus others being in the wrong. And the like, I mean, it's all about perception. Like, this sort of goes full circle over and over, is that these secession movements all believed that in some form or another they were wrong. Whether that is the Irish that say the British are allocating more money to the British Museum than to famine relief, or the Hungarians saying that the Austrians are trying to break us up by giving Banjalajic more powers than he deserves to have, or Schleswig-Holstein saying, "Ooh, the Danish king is trying to break the duchies up," or Southerners saying Lincoln is trying to end slavery. It's perception, but that perception of an assault on your imagined community is then leading to a break, and it speaks to the incompleteness, I think, of the nation state development at this time, that there's such a major flux still during this period with regard to people wanting to separate. And in some cases it makes total sense, right? Like the Hungarians saying we don't want to be ruled by Austrians. In some cases it makes not a lot of sense, at least ethnicity wise. Like the Sicilians saying we don't want to be ruled by a Bourbon and Naples. In some cases it's very selfish, like in the case of Southerners wanting to own slaves. In some cases, like there's sympathy we can give, right? It's the Indian people wanting to break away from British rule.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, it comes. That is it, though. That is really it. But it is very much. This ties on a broader point. This is an interconnected world. People know what's going on in each other's countries. People are very aware of what is happening. We mentioned earlier Lincoln's admirer of Kossuth goes to hear him speak when he visits the United States. People in Britain are watching the Civil War. Americans are aware of the Indian Mutiny or Indian War of Independence, whatever you want to call it. They're all very much aware of what's going on. They're paying attention, and they do actually, I don't necessarily copy each other, but to the extent that's what they do. Human beings are imitative. We imitate each other, and they do that. Of course, everybody has their own personal national slant on things, but it's very interesting the way they do follow what each other's up to, and make comparisons, favorable, unfavorable, based on what other people have done.
Yeah, lingering on that aspect, that, sort of the connectiveness of globalism. One of the biggest aspects of the Confederacy and the Civil War was that they were vying for international legitimacy, to legitimize their cause, to have foreign support militarily, politically. Um, what was sort of the international reaction to the American Civil War, especially when it comes to the European nations who were the targets of diplomatic efforts from both sides to recognize them?
You got the right to keep people on the podcast for this one. uh, you want to start with Britain and I take the continent, Duncan?
All right, sure. I mean, the trouble is, it varies. It varies from place to place. This is the problem. I mean, it's one thing. Of course, the air conditioning comes on now. Welcome to Southern California. No, it's the problem is that in a lot of ways they take from it what they want to take from it. I think that's an overriding issue. I mean, my first book was about the fact that, contrary to a myth that still exists, the British didn't split on political lines over the Civil War. You can find radicals supporting the South on the grounds they think the South has a right of independence, same as Hungarians, Poles, everybody else. And they say this out loud. On the other end, you've got conservative Britons, Duke of Argyll and company, who are absolutely opposed to the South. Either they're opposed to it because of slavery, they won't support slavery, or else they're opposed to it because Britain's an empire. It's got secessionist movements in the empire. Ireland is the most obvious example. So this is what people take away from it. They don't necessarily take away what people would think they do. But in a lot of ways, the South miscalculates very, very badly. They believe that Britain will enter the war in order to get cotton. And first of all, Britain's trade with the northern states is actually greater than with the South. And second of all, there's no actual need to go to war for cotton because Britain's got a glut of the stuff even before the war starts. So it's a strange kind of idea. The other reality is, in the 19th century, there's something of an equilibrium diplomatically, in that intervening in other states' affairs is generally frowned upon. It's because everybody is dealing with this new rising nationalism. There's a reluctance, a marked reluctance in the 19th century to interfere in other people's domestic issues. This is not the same as the late 18th century when France and Spain entered the War of Independence on America's side. You don't have those kinds of governments. You don't have that kind of diplomatic world anymore. It's very, very different. Go ahead, Niels.
Yeah, and I was going to say too that in some cases, like the Austrian Empire, right? They what happens in North America, it may just be what happens on the moon for them because it's of very little diplomatic importance. And actually supporting the South would be counterproductive because if they support the South, how you say to Hungarians, like, oh, sorry, we supported the South, but you can't do that. And to stretch Duncan's point a little bit further, it also comes down to priorities, right? Northerners and Southerners are fighting each other. So what? in 4 years, in 5 years, in 6 years, this war is over. It's either a unified country again and we got cotton, or it's a separate country and we get cotton, or we can trade in North America. Um, if it's separated, great. It's weaker. Maybe we have still to watch some more because now the South will be expansionistic or the North will be expansionistic. But in the great scheme right now, there's no point to intervene because, from British perspective too, they don't even seem to know what they're arguing about or fighting about, right? Like, and then, as I kind of make in other places as an argument, for a lot of Europeans, and especially the British Empire, what happens in North America is not as crucial as what happens with Russia. Very contemporary, if you think of it today, that there was a desire for the last decades to contain Russia, and it will continue for decades. That's why Britain expands into Afghanistan, because Britain is worried the Russians will come towards India, the crown jewel in Asia. The Russians will get a foothold in the Mediterranean and threaten the Eastern Mediterranean power for the British. So when it comes down to it, and makes that case somewhere else, that when Britain has to, and these European powers have to evaluate adventure in North America, unpredictable, unclear reasons why, dubious morality if we side with the South, or a case of containing an autocratic expansionist empire in our own backyard, that takes priority for them.
I mean, it's also with Russia, for instance. Russia was broadly in favor of the Union because it saw it as a counterweight to Britain. Okay, and the fact is, I mean, people often present this purchase of Alaska by Seward as like this great feat of American diplomacy. What's often forgotten is what the Russians were looking at was it was more likely or not the British, in the guise of the Canadians, would seize Alaska. So in many ways, selling it to the United States was a better option for the Russians. So in some ways, and it was also an act of friendship towards the U.S. as well. So in some ways, the Russian selling of Alaska is very much grows out of these power politics. One, Russia wants to keep the U.S. sweet, and it's got this problem that it really can't defend Alaska in the final analysis. So it's a lot of this diplomatic stuff. It's less kind of the views are often just straightforward power politics, and that's how they operate. And the U.S. does this to a certain extent as well. I mean, it's just the reality. Diplomacy hasn't changed that much in some respects.
Yeah, it goes back to the opening quote of the book, the lust for power. But I do think it is an interesting point that Niels made about wanting to keep or not caring about the Civil War, because either way you're going to get trade. But even if they do split, now it's weaker, and we're still sort of living in the age of imperialism. Um, so then it sort of becomes an easier target. Obviously, Britain is very involved in America up until this point. But following the Civil War, we talk about all of these different identities of nationalism brewing, leading to the Civil War. How did the nation unite and develop a common nationalism following the Civil War? How did they mend those schisms?
The reality is, it was more or less achieved at the expense of African Americans. I mean, that's what reconciliation came down to. Frederick Douglass was right about that. Reconstruction, a serious effort is made to make African American citizens. That's more or less abandoned, and the South is allowed to, well, do what it wants, essentially. And African Americans basically, okay, they're no longer slaves, that's gone, but they now find themselves as second class citizens or even third class citizens. Um, and the other thing that unites is another other, namely the Spanish. The Spanish American War is crucial in bringing the South back into the Union. It's this national pride of taking on another foreigner as opposed to fighting each other. So I do think it's a lot of the same issues, that take place. Othering of an internal African American, And then the external threat, the Spanish, helps bring about national unity.
I would actually go a different route. I agree on part with Duncan, but I think on another level that there wasn't as much unity as we like to think, because it is in the not in the immediate because in the immediate aftermath of the war with Reconstruction, of course, we have what some historians have now described as sort of a um, southern internal civil war, where African Americans with military units, militia units, and white Southerners fight each other, and it's sort of a power struggle for who eventually emerges out of Reconstruction successfully. We know the answer to that already. We see at the end of the 19th century, we see emergence of the United Confederate Veteran, United Daughters of the Confederacy, and Sons of Confederate Veterans. You get all these organizations that want to commemorate the lost cause, a skewed version of American history of the American Civil War, and and they put up monuments all over the place, right? So from my perspective, at least, the Southern national identity isn't dead. It reinvented itself with a lost cause, but it continues on. And you really see that, and that's why I was very glad we included a chapter on memory in the book, because it is a clashing point for the people, right? You look at Chattanooga, as a Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park when it's created, and the veterans themselves are making an effort. Leaders in the veterans groups are making an effort to create this park. One, Chickamauga U.S. Confederate victory, Chattanooga U.S. victory. So there is for both sides something here, and it's intended. It's marketed to Congress as a place for reconciliation, right? To bring the country back together. Like Duncan says, we're right at the edge here of the war with Spain. So it's this moment where we want that unity. And you look at the speeches, you look at the things people say in the lead up to this. And I always like that Gazette from Ohio that says that it makes a true soldier's blood boil to see these battlefields marked with rebel monuments. So that the veterans themselves, U.S. veterans, they weren't looking for reconciliation. They didn't look at Southerners, at least veterans from the war, as again fellow countrymen. Right? They didn't quite forgive this, and I think that sort of we want to see the country as coming together, and we kind of see Native Americans or African Americans or Chinese or Japanese as sort of the othering eventually that kind of helps unify white people in the country, and Spain as the enemy in the War of 1898. But if we look at the conversation still today, this is Southern nationalism is existing. It's strong with some parts of in some parts of the country. So I I would actually push against that and say it's not quite over. It's not quite that union has has been fully reestablished.
That's an interesting point about Union soldiers and their blood boiling, that the battlefields are littered with Confederate monuments. They didn't see them as their countrymen. That's an interesting point. But going back to what Duncan said about um, the conclusion of the Civil War, basically at the expense of African Americans, I'm going to sort of offer a hot take for the sake of conversation. And I'm going to say that the South actually won the Civil War. And here's why. Following the Constitutional Convention, we had the Three-Fifths Clause, which gave African Americans three-fifths representation in government. They didn't have the right to vote, but they had three-fifths of their population represented in government. Following the Civil War and the abolition of that, the abolition of slavery, we can now identify what we can call the Five-Fifths Clause. Now they were fully representative in government, and they had the right to vote, but because of Southern repression of voting, literacy clause, literally literacy tests and grandfather clauses, poll taxes, all sorts of these things. They still weren't really able to vote, but now they had full representation in Congress, which really just gave Southerners much more political power.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, I would agree. But I would not stretch it as far as a certain historian who actually puts that on her book cover. Because I mean, in the end, the United States did win, right? The free labor ideology of the United States has permeated into the South. You can make a case that the South and the West kind of are in an imperial industrial economic relationship with the North and North Midwestern sort of industrial power of the United States. So
But I would also add African Americans weren't exactly passive either, because you had the great migrations even before civil rights, where African Americans kind of spread out across the country. In many ways, you could say that by getting out of the South, they reclaimed some certain aspects of Reconstruction. And the success varied from place to place. I think that's vital too. Um, the trouble, of course, always comes down to the fact that most Northerners did not, in fact, care for African Americans that much before the Civil War began. I mean, we know about, for instance, many of the Western states wouldn't allow black migration in there, free or enslaved. It's so in some ways, it's one of these aspects that is sometimes perhaps forgotten about or not paid enough attention to. And it was Jesse Jackson, I believe, who said the U.S. didn't become a democracy till the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because until then, ultimately, African Americans in many places of the U.S. did not actually have the vote, despite the fact they're constitutionally guaranteed it. So, I mean, what do we end the American Civil War in 1965 instead of 1865, as Mr. Jackson would have it? I don't know. I mean, this is where it comes down to. I will say, though, there was a serious, I mean, I take Niels' point about the veterans, but there was a serious attempt at reconciliation after Reconstruction. And there was a serious campaign in terms of American textbooks and so forth, writers and stuff, trying to emphasize the valor on both sides and downplay slavery. So I mean, there was, again, with this imagined community, there was a lot of imagining going on. And for instance, Theodore Roosevelt, the president, he was a nephew of James T. Bullock, who built the Confederate cruisers in Britain. So and the two met and all the rest of it. So there was a serious attempt to try bring about reconciliation, which is also about imagining a nation. And I think that's important too. That is another aspect. There wasn't necessarily it wasn't necessarily a natural coming together, as Niels points out. There was also quite a natural, dare I say, propagandist aspect to it as well. Um, and it's like, yeah, I mean, look at the film "The Birth of a Nation" by Griffiths. I mean, that's an example of propaganda right there, and it's a very effective propaganda.
well, and I would add to that too, right? Kind of like building on what you're saying, that the focus of the country shifts by the end of Reconstruction. That eventually this, dare we say, Southern problem gets pushed aside because the Western problem is bigger. And the focus of the country turns west, right? Like send people into the West, like assimilate Native Americans, like pacify the West, build more railroad connections through the country, exploit oil, mining, gold, silver reserves out there. And that kind of then eventually leads into the imperial push of the United States. So it's sort of, okay, this is over. Let's move on to things that are more interesting for the country. It's sort of like, right, it's the kids that has, oh, the old toy is broken and damaged and it's not interesting anymore. Oh, there's a new birthday gift and toys that I can now play with. And that's the American West.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Going back to what Duncan said earlier about the Spanish American War, war unites people. As unfortunate as it is, it's an interesting phenomenon throughout history, in that war tends to bring people together with a common cause. if you've ever read 1984, that's why they're always at war with East Asia, is to keep the people with a common enemy. It keeps them sort of submissive and united. Looking at the Civil War, you guys wrote a chapter about this. Was the Civil War the first modern war?
No, that's the short answer. It's one of three modernizing wars, along with the Crimean War and the Franco-German War. It's the all three of the American Civil War. A lot of the stuff that appears new and exciting has been tried out in the Crimean War already, such as iron ships as the obvious ones, breech-loading rifles. It's things are definitely developed in the Civil War. It's the first time two ironclads fight each other, but the French use ironclads to take a Russian fort in the Crimean War. Britain and France are in a naval race with iron ships. The French using hot air balloons like Thaddeus Lowe for spotting enemy movements. The French do that first in the French Revolutionary Wars. That the French are first with the ballooning. A lot of this, it's definitely an important conflict because of all these changes. It helps inaugurate with these other conflicts, but it's not the first modern war. And I think one of the dead giveaways is this: the overwhelming majority of casualties in the American Civil War died of disease. That's a very, very old war problem. Come the First World War and the Second World War, men aren't dying of disease anymore. They're dying because of enemy action, bombs, artillery, that kind of thing. So it's a lot less of a modern war than people tend to think. But I do think it is a modernizing war, and that's what we say. If you look at it with these other two conflicts, it fits very well into this ongoing transformation of the 19th century, including in bad ways like war.
And in part, I think too, it's sort of what we claim it. We say it's the modernizing wars, but it's also sort of a war, and it's the wars of this period that are stuck in sort of an odd limbo. They have this modern technology, right? We have rifled artillery, we have rifled muskets, we have greater range of those weapons. All of a sudden, we can fire more accurately, but on the tactical level, on the battlefield, the commanders aren't using it in that way. And the result is that we're still using Napoleonic war tactics, right? Line up, shoot, hope you hit something. Well, yes, you're hitting something was actually pretty well because your weapon is much more accurate now and has longer range. But that you see it a little bit towards the end eventually, right? Like I'm thinking here of, I think it's Emery Upton's charge at Spotsylvania, where he kind of tries something different with his men charging the enemy line. But it's few and far in between that you see sort of a new approach to tactics during the Civil War. And that holds true for all of it, right? Like whether it's the Germans in like the Dano-German War, like charging against entrenched position in close formation, or like things of that nature. So it's sort of it's an oddity too, in that most wars of the 19th century don't pitch outside of the Napoleonic Wars and then the endpoint of the Second World War. This is the one moment where we actually pitch the great powers against each other. And we're trying in with large army formations, battlefield tactics, experiment with new weaponry, because most of the rest of the century it's against indigenous people or colonial subjects that are rebelling, right? I'm thinking of the wars there in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean Sherman kind of gives it away, doesn't he, when he says the Battle of Sedan proves that the breech loading rifle and the much faster firing heralds the end of cavalry. And he basically says that happened in this Battle of Sedan, the Franco-German War, and also happened to us, meaning the American Civil War. So there's a kind of rueful acknowledgement there that some of their stuff they're sticking to old. Their technology is making some of their tactics and strategies obsolete, and Sherman's got enough self-awareness to point that out in his memoirs.
I think that goes also back to one of the points Duncan made, right? The naval arms race between Britain and France over ironclad vessels. Those are high seas vessels that can project, like the HMS Warrior, can project British power anywhere in the world. The Monitor can't even get 100 miles off the coast, considering it sinks in a storm off the coast of North Carolina, right? The US ironclads are built for a very specific purpose along the coast of the United States to get through the coastal fortifications. They're not intended to project US power. They're a great experiment. Actually, you could give the Confederates more credit. They are actually planning much more projecting power vessels in a modern fashion, which they try to build in Britain, like the Laird Rams. So it's sort of a really interesting situation that some of this modernization is a learning experience. Like, what do we do? How do we best do it? And then later wars will learn from it or not. Right? The British did not. Nobody really learned was trench warfare, but it's sort of how can we make these weapons even more deadly, more projecting, more powerful.
Yeah, I think this was a really dangerous time in American history, and I think we sort of see it culminate in World War One. We have this rapid military technological advancement in arms, navies, fire rates, distance accuracy, all of these sorts of things. They rapidly um, develop, but the battlefield tactics and sort of, like Niels, like you said, it's a learning experience. The battlefield tactics didn't necessarily develop at the same rate. So by World War One, we're still seeing this trench warfare, but because arms are so developed for that time and they're so accurate and dangerous, we just see such devastation. I mean, it's such a brutal, devastating war. Just lines are gridlocked. And then World War II, we sort of see different tactics and tanks and blitzkrieg and rapid movement and all these sorts of things. But in World War One, you have this rapid military advancement from this time, but it took a while for commanders and battlefield tactics to catch up.
Sure, and the Russian Ukrainian war that's going right now has suddenly alerted us all to the power of the drone. So this is happening right now as we speak. Sudden breakthroughs in or things that are changing the face of the battlefield, which none of us, or at least I, wasn't really aware of or thought about until this happened.
But then, as a counterpoint, right? When you look at like Bakhmut and other places along the front lines, some of it looks exactly like World War One. Dig trenches, attacks the enemy trench, like mass formations on the part of the Russians to go after them. So we have modern stuff like the drones, which are like, incredible how the Ukrainians are using it in many ways. But then you have old tactics that we're still using, right? Like, how do you escape the enemy's fire? Start digging.
How much of that though is just the Russians being Russians? It seems for all of time the Russian tactics have been to just throw as many bodies as possible at the issue.
Yeah, hard to tell. But even then, the Russians have gotten clever with their drones too, which suggests that the Kremlin's also thinking about how to use these things. And I guarantee the Pentagon is now looking at how to use these things. I'm pretty sure the French Ministry of Defense is looking at how to use these things. Ditto the British. So again, I think this is a lot that's going on. It's interesting though.
Well, but I think this sort of another part that we can consider, even that takes us back to the American Civil War, right? If you are, and the Ukrainians are in this case, the weaker side, on paper, they are the weaker side, you become more innovative with the stuff you have, right? Oh, I have drones. I can duct tape a bomb to this drone and blow up Russians. Wow. In the Confederate case, oh, I can put gunpowder in a metal canister, floats that out with a cable attached to it to a US warship, and sink it. Amazing, right? Like, or less so when if you run into Sherman, oh, I can bury those things in the road and blow up American troops. Oops, now I have to walk in front of those guys to dig up those things.
Yeah, it's scary to think, especially looking forward, because technology advances exponentially. It's kind of scary to think about where military technology will be in the future. Um, but going back to the U.S. and nationalism, how has American nationalism? We talk a little bit about it post Civil War. How has it evolved from the Civil War to today? Niels, you mentioned that we're still sort of grappling with that North South identity today.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it goes back. It I hate to say it again, but it depends. Like it depends very much politically where you land in the United States and what you believe in. That um, for many, and I just made that actually as a point to my classes. For many, we're sort of the United States is a melting pot, like different cultures that have come together and kind of some weird new tomato soup has emerged that submerged every ingredient in it. And then in other cases, it's sort of that salad bowl where all these different ingredients are visible and create somewhat of a unique new thing. So I think there's still a bit of a struggle of what the United States is even today, right? Where do Hispanic immigrants in the United States fit in? What's the place of the Spanish language now that Hispanic make up a very substantial part of the population? There's always an influx of immigrants, like myself, like Duncan on some level. We're both immigrants. We're not native born US citizens. We bring things to the United States. We bring interpretations to the United States. We bring our own views to the United States. So I think in that regard, if we think of it as a continuous process of imagining the United States, will never fully be done.
No, and it's also kind of interesting because it's both in some ways more unified and a lot less unified. And I like it's interesting. Niels talked about the Southern identity earlier. And it's kind of interesting because I taught a course in the South and I was spoken to Southerners, and it's sort of like the Southern identity has more or less been erased. Everywhere in the South are strip malls. Television has been a massive unifying aspect of American culture. It's been demonstrated US regional accents are no longer as powerful as they once were because people are taking cues from television. So in some ways, you've got this push, capitalism and technology pulling Americans together. At the same time, you have things that are pulling it apart, like the internet, where there's a million different opinions depending on which sites you want to go to, and each one of these sites, has a completely different independent view. And then, of course, yes, you have immigration. You've got the debates around the presidential election this year, and it's kind of odd how this is. It's on one hand, it's the regional identities been smoothed out, but in a lot of ways, political and ethnic identities have been made much more visible, and in some ways, much more assertive. So it's kind of this strange combination of the two, I would say.
Yeah, 100%. Looking to the future, how do you see that sense of nationalism developing in the future? We're so politically divided today. A lot of people talk about, which is something that I definitely disagree with and don't buy into. Could the United States see another civil war? Will the United States ever split into separate factions or partition? What do you guys think about that discussion, and where do you see nationalism going forward?
All right, I'll start. I'll get the ball rolling, and then Niels can pitch in. Uh, I'll go with Duncan's superficial take first. I don't see any civil war taking place because I don't see the necessary mechanics in place. You don't have the state authorities like you had. If you look at any other, don't look at the American Civil War. Look at the Spanish Civil War. I don't see any American general who can basically persuade all the troops to march to Washington and install him as dictator in the way Franco did. So the kind of ingredients of any kind of civil war, I'm not really seeing because I'm not sure how you would do it. I think the bigger issue I see is the so-called big sort of Americans moving into their own kind of areas where you have increasingly like some states, for instance, will have harsh abortion laws, others will have complete pro choice, some will have absolute separation of church and state, others will maybe have some way of slipping religion in the back door. I see that more of a divide, but you'd still have a functioning nation. That would be, at least in the immediate future, that's what I see. The other reality is globalization is not going away. People are just much more connected. I mean, the internet's another example. You're talking to people usually, if you're in online chats or anything like that, you're talking to people all over the world. You're not just talking to your own fellow citizens anymore that you did in the past. So consequently, you are in some ways better, not I wouldn't say necessarily better informed about abroad, but you might have a better grasp of what's going on in other places. And I think that kind of militates against extreme nationalism. Anyway, that's kind of my hope. I tend to be an optimist on these matters. Niels?
Oh man, now you set me up as a pessimist. That's terrible, Dunk. You're gonna sleep on the couch when we meet in October, mate. um, no, actually, I'm gonna pick right up where Duncan left off with the internet and globalization. Right, he's totally right. We are more connected today than we have ever been. Right, I'm literally sitting in my room upstairs talking to a person in California and in Florida, um, while like the world's going on. Right? And there's like no lack in communication. We're instantaneous talking to each other. But I think at the same time that we're more connected, we're also less connected these days. That it is so much easier for me to go on Twitter and just see what I want to see with regard to news. I can literally filter out and go, or I can be on True Social and just see one side. I can watch Fox News and see one side of everything. So it's a lot easier to be um, in a bubble. But I think the other part, and I'll have to, I want to watch myself time wise here to not go too long on this, but it's great prep for, I have a talk in a few, less than 10 days on the US election coming up. So this is practice. Thank you, Jake. Um, I think there's a difference between nationalism, right, and patriotism here. And I think nationalism wise, we are seeing, we have people in the United States who we all agree we want the nation to survive. We all want the nation to be prosperous. We all want the nation to be successful. And just like Hamilton and Jefferson, we agree on how to get there. Whether that is religious, whether that is liberal, whether that is um, sort of giving businesses the ability to do as they please or to regulate them, whatever it is, there's disagreement on that. And that sort of has led to this tribalism, right? We're kind of in these self-selected communities, imagined communities of, ooh, I'm going to this Baptist church. I vote for Trump. I wear the flag. I have a barbecue every Sunday. I have Kool-Aid for breakfast. I don't know what unites you, but something that unites you in your views in this imagined community of yours within the country. And we have a very, like you said, we have a very stark difference these days that we don't even talk to each other. We don't even hang out together anymore. We're so ingrained in our little tribal groups that it is hard to see the other side. Um, and this is a point where I'm going to disagree with Duncan because I think that there is a chance for violence in the United States. Part of the reason why I came to Europe is that concern. We look at January 6th, right? Confederates, and we put that in the book after I kind of pointed this out and was like, we need to include this. Confederates never made it into the capital of the United States. They never got close to Washington, right? Fort Stevens, Lincoln getting shot at and told to lay down, stupid fools that he was, supposedly. That's how close they got. But on January 6th, the Confederate flag made it into the Capitol building. So it's interesting that there is these days unimaginable a possibility that the United States government could be overthrown, right? Something that said earlier, Latin America, right? In Latin America, that was part and parcel of early independence. In the United States, we finally have come to that point. And I think it could happen. That is a possibility. I would not blame that on nationalism, so I would blame that on the tribalism that has taken hold. But I think that much more likely would be some situation where a civil war would be between the people, right? That, oh, my neighbor has a Trump sign, I'm going to shoot at you. Oh, my neighbor has a Harris Walz sign, I'm going to shoot at them. I think that would be, or, oh, this car in front of me has a bumper sticker for the other party, I will shoot at them. I think that kind of microaggression, micro-violence is much more likely. Not the scale of the Civil War, but it would still be a lot of dead bodies, probably.
I'm sorry, Duncan, but I think I'm gonna have to agree with the pessimistic view of Niels here. Not necessarily on the Civil War aspect. There may be sort of that sporadic violence, especially either way, however this election plays out. You could see violence from either side, I think. But in terms of escalating to a national civil war, I don't see that happening. But I wholeheartedly agree with you on what you said before. You were kind of preaching to the choir. I sort of take on a more pessimistic view about globalism. I think in terms of social media, we are more connected than ever. But in terms of humans, we are more disconnected than ever. When we go on social media, we only see one side. Like you said, we're living in a bubble and we don't have real human interaction anymore. Everyone sort of retreats to social media and being keyboard warriors. No one goes out and actually talks face to face. I think COVID was a really big um, catalyst for that. We all got shut in our houses for extended periods of time, and it really was damaging to the human soul and social interaction and having a third space to just go hang out with other fellow human beings and talk about things and see them face to face. I think that was very damaging for us. And I also think that globalism can suppress cultures around the world. We can see assimilation. And I think one of the most beautiful aspects of humanity is our diversity of culture all across the world. And I think that should be celebrated and respected by each other, but not necessarily forced to assimilate and have those diverse cultures be destroyed. Um, Building off of that, what advice would you give to young people who are trying to find themselves and discover themselves and find their place in sort of this globalist, nationalist, complicated, divided world we find ourselves in?
I think I'm the oldest at 55, so I'll go first. Um, yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there, and both of you, I'm not criticizing you for being pessimistic. You're both right. You both raise valid points. But the world has always been in some kind of crisis or another. I have a great uncle who was killed in the First World War. Um, my Scottish grandfather spoke both English and Gaelic fluently. My dad speaks some words of Gaelic. I speak no Gaelic at all. So this business of cultures being erased has been going on for a long time. There's a lot of negative, bad stuff out there, and I would never dispute that. On the other hand, you really are in an incredible age. If you want to be an educated person, you will. This is beyond belief. I'm of a generation who remembers when there was no internet. You want to try find a book, an obscure text. Good luck. Nowadays, you can just go online and get it. The Library of Alexandria has nothing on what's out there. So yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff out there. There's a lot of good stuff out there as well. So I would basically effectively advise them to go for the good. Educate yourself, learn, try to avoid being stuck in the bubble. And yeah, this business of us not talking to people, that's in the case of COVID, yeah, that we can say that was enforced on us. But there's nothing to stop me from picking up the phone and calling one of my colleagues and suggesting we go out and have drinks or have lunch or anything like that. As Ian Forster said, only connect. We can do this. We're capable of it. And people in the past, they had it much, much worse than we do, incomparably worse than we do. In fact, I think in some ways, truthfully, we're quite spoiled compared to the folks of the 19th century. And I do think we were absolutely spoiled in terms of just diets, access to information, all the rest of it. So in some ways, yeah, there's incredible opportunities that people in the past never had. So seize them. That would be my advice.
I'm going to step out the pessimist role and actually do the optimist one too. Well, I will fully concede and 100% concede Duncan is the older one. I get the younger students to teach these days. So I have the young minds that have to influence and actually encourage. Um, pursue your dreams, right? Like Duncan said it, and I would actually take it away from education, right? Like, yes, there's abundance of opportunity with regard to education. Don't get stuck in your bubble, right? Like, I remember when we lived in Hobbs, New Mexico, my wife worked with a teacher at the high school who had grown up in Hobbs, had gone to college in Hobbs, had pursued an online master's degree, and now was a volleyball coach at the school. Right? You never left your bubble. Get out of your bubble. Go somewhere, right? Even if it's just for 4 years in college, go somewhere fun, like exciting. Like, God, I traveled thousands of miles to go to college away from the family. And yes, I have returned to exactly the same place I grew up, but it is a very interesting experience. I'm saying, like, if you have the chance to go to Asia for 5 years, go when you're young, right? Like, experience the world, see the world. Like, dancing about family and all that other stuff. But like, just like, pursue your dreams, right? Dream big. Like, there's things that will stop you, but if you want to do something and accomplish something, you probably can. There's more opportunities these days than even 50 years ago.
Yeah, I 100% agree with both of you. I guess we'll all leave off on an optimistic note, which I guess is a good thing. Um, I sort of took the pessimistic view of globalism, but Duncan, you raised some very valid points that I do agree with. I think access to information is so crucial. We have the ability to attain any sort of information that we want. And speaking to what both of you said, I think having an open mind with that is so important. I think it's one of the most important things we can do in our generation today. Is have an open mind, be willing to talk about these things, um, be willing to hear the other side, be empathetic, and be curious. I think ultimately, you know, don't don't be so comfortable, scrolling TikTok and watching Netflix. Get out of your house, get a little bit uncomfortable, be curious, read books about whatever you're interested in. I love history and politics, so I decided to start a podcast to talk about it and talk with wonderful people like you. If you like science and rocks, just read books about it. Be curious, expand your mind. I think that's so important. But I greatly appreciate both of you taking the time to chat with me today. It was an absolute pleasure. This was one of the most fascinating and in-depth conversations I've had. Your book, I think, was wonderful. It really opened up my perspective on the American Civil War and on the 19th century in general. So thank you guys for coming on, and thank you for the work you're doing.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for inviting us. Wonderful to be here.